The preparation was one of the reasons that those teams were so good. We had nothing like that in Washington. And when I got to New Jersey, we had nothing like that in New Jersey. And I was bringing my scouting reports from the year before from the Sonics with me and sharing them with the guys when we were playing other teams, because a lot of the personnel was still the same, and they had tendencies. This guy turns over his left shoulder 65% of the time and his right shoulder 35% of the time, and they just didn't have that anywhere else that I had played. They had it at other teams in the league that I'd come to find out. But when you hear about the way the Sonics operated, you want to be a part of that franchise because you knew they were committed in every way to excellence, and that's what you wanted to be a part of.
And you are in Australia right now.
You're talking NBA basketball. You're talking great teams. You're talking great individual players.
Takes it off, and there's number 23, and of course Johnny goes nuts.
So we're all getting goosebumps thinking about it now.
I just tried to go out there and play my game.
I have no idea what you're talking about, Adam. I don't like anybody. I'm not a people person.
Strand, you make the pass, yes. Christian, can you catch the ball? Yes.
All the stars were aligned and all the muscles fired at the right time, and I was able to get off the ground and throw one down.
I was saving that as a surprise for you.
And now, introducing your host for In All Airness, Adam Ryan.
Welcome to episode 39. Thanks for joining me. My website, inallairness.com. Just add a / and the episode number to view show notes. On this special two-part episode, I'm excited to welcome Marquette great and 7-year NBA veteran Jim McIlvaine. In a first for the podcast, the conversation will be released in 2 installments. Our chat was almost 2 hours in length. I'm pretty sure that Jim's wife had the authorities on speed dial, ready to report him missing. However, all's well that ends well. He did return to normality at its conclusion, and I couldn't be any happier with the finished episode. In part 1 of this chat, we discussed Jim's early years playing basketball and learn a great deal about his college career, where he was a standout at Marquette University. This includes a funny story too about Marquette's early 1990s exhibition series that touched down here in Australia, then on to New Zealand and also Fiji, complete with a near international incident. If you are a fan of the great documentary Hoop Dreams, you'll definitely want to hear this episode as well. We talk about the 1994 NBA draft and Jim's 2 seasons in Washington playing for the Bullets. He openly discusses his free agent move to Seattle, a contract widely discussed and debated at the time and mentioned on occasion even to this day. On top of this, we learn about the importance and value of the National Basketball Retired Players Association, also known as the NBRPA, of which Jim is a lifetime member. You'll be hard-pressed to find a more open, honest and engaging guy than Jim McIlvaine. I'm confident that you'll enjoy the conversation as much as I did recording it. Thanks again, Jim, for your candour and also for being available to chat for this length of time. We're now into the final days of 2013 as this episode is being released. I hope you thoroughly enjoy the holiday season and have a great new year. Exciting plans are ahead for 2014. I hope that you will continue to join me on this podcast journey, and thank you very much for your support to date. Now, on to the show. My guest today was named the NCAA's top defensive player in 1994 as a senior at Marquette, and he's a 7-year NBA veteran. He has many strings to his bow and is currently a radio broadcaster at Marquette. Jim McIlvaine, thanks for joining me.
It's my pleasure.
I appreciate you taking the time to chat. Now, we'll get into your college career in just a moment, but I'd like to just quickly make mention that you were born and raised in Wisconsin and played your high school basketball there too, which is very similar to a former guest of the podcast and a fellow NBA veteran, Joe Wolf.
I talk to Joe on a regular basis.
So you've got some very interesting links as far as both being born in the same state and being high school standouts as well. So that's an interesting little correlation there.
A lot of people consider him to be the best high school player to ever play in the state of Wisconsin. He grew up in a much smaller town, and I think they won the state championship in their Division 3 out of the 4 years he was there. His older brother played at North Carolina as well as him, and just a phenomenal talent and a really great family as well.
Yeah, just some interesting parallels there that I found when I was researching for our chat today. And I know that in high school as well that you were really a dominant player too. So do you mind just perhaps quickly talking about your entry into basketball and when you sort of first started playing and how your skills developed to become such a great high school player too?
I started playing in 2nd grade, and it was, again, kind of like me being a Packer fan. It was more social than anything. All the kids in my school and my class played basketball, and And I was really always tall for my age, and so it seemed like a smart thing to do just to hang out with my friends. And I started doing it then and just kind of stuck with it. And as years went on, got better and better at it.
Definitely. Now, you were a 4-year player at Marquette University, and interestingly, I noticed that in your first 2 games as a freshman, you played against Duke in a preseason NIT game, and then also you were at Kansas. So both those teams would end up playing each other in the 91 NCAA championship game. So that seems like a pretty imposing welcome to the college ranks.
It was worse than it sounds. I had a series of concussions at the beginning of my freshman season, so I was held out of the Duke game, but never missed another game. But it wasn't just at Duke and at Kansas. We played at North Carolina State when they had Rodney Monroe and Chris Corciani and Tom Gugliotta. We played at Oklahoma State when they had Byron Houston and Big Country. And we had number 12 Virginia at home that year. I think we had the toughest non-conference schedule in the country. And Marquette, with myself and Damon Key and Rob Lagerman, had a really highly touted recruiting class, and Chuck Breaks as well. We anticipated, I don't know about we, but I guess the coaches maybe thought we'd do a fair little better than we did. We had another player who was supposed to be our point guard and ended up being dismissed from the team. And then my roommate for 4 years, Rob Lagerman, was a shooting guard, and he was kind of thrust into the point guard position, and not really a true point guard. He struggled with that. I think we set the school record for turnovers in a season, and we played against some really good teams. I think we played at Michigan as well the year after they won the national championship. It was really a trial by fire as freshmen. Like they say, whatever doesn't kill you is going to make you stronger.
Yeah, do you mind if I just ask, did the concussions come about from some preseason scrimmages, or how did that sort of happen?
Yeah, it was all stuff that happened in practices, and I didn't know it at the time, but when you get one concussion, you're more susceptible to getting future ones. And so, practices and things like that were very physical, and we're being taught to dive on the floor for loose balls, and I picked up one and then had a couple more in short succession, and then they held me out for a while, but just to be safe, but everything was fine from that point forward.
Okay. Now, just before we get into talking about your sophomore season there, my research indicates that in 1991, you were part of USA Basketball's US Olympic Festival. I actually hadn't heard of this. Where did this actually take place, and how was that experience?
I don't know the genesis of that whole program, but it was kind of a precursor to the Olympic program for the United States, and it was actually quite an elaborate festival. We played out at Pauley Pavilion at UCLA, and the opening ceremonies were at Dodger Stadium, and Evander Holyfield was there. Yeah, he was there, and he kind of ran the torch around the stadium, and it was really impressive the way that whole thing came down. Actually, that's where I met my wife. She didn't remember meeting me, but I was playing on the East team, and her sister, Heidi Gillingham, was a 3-time All-American at Vanderbilt, and she was playing on the South team, and my wife, Gwendolyn, came out to watch with her parents. I met the whole Gillingham family out there. Between my wife and her sister and all the Olympic festivals they'd gone to, Gwendolyn kind of doesn't have that great of a memory, and they all kind of blurred together, and so she didn't really remember meeting me specifically out there, but her sister remembered meeting me.
Sure. Am I right to suggest that Gwendolyn was also a very good college basketball player as well for North Carolina?
Yeah, she did okay. She was on the team that won the national championship in 1994 with Marion Jones. Coach Hatchell was coaching that team. She had a really nice collegiate career. She was actually a really good volleyball player as well. Her sister and her sat down and talked about, are they going to play basketball or are they going to play volleyball? And there was no question Heidi was going to play basketball, but it was more of a decision for Gwendolyn, and I know she was looking at Baylor for volleyball, but they both agreed that her future would be better and she'd have more opportunities if she played basketball. So, and I guess the school colors of North Carolina factored into it a little bit, which seems weird, but it kind of went with her eyes. And I asked Terry Mitchell, the coach at Marquette, a couple of years ago, I said, do you ever deal with anything like that? Because it seemed like the same thing for her sister Heidi when she decided to go to Vanderbilt. She didn't go to North Carolina because she didn't like the team photo on the media guide. And this is a girl that in the Tennessee Athletic Hall of Fame, 3-time All-American, took the team to the Final Four, and she passed on a school because she didn't like the picture in a media guide. And Coach Mitchell at Marquette said, we get girls all the time who don't want to play basketball at Marquette because they want to go to a school that has football because they want to meet a husband from the football team. And Marquette doesn't have a football program, so that's a factor for girls, I guess, that play college basketball.
Yeah, that all comes into the decision-making process, I'm sure. And also, I've got a few questions later on in the chat, hopefully, that we'll get to about media guides and things like that, because I know that you have a penchant for going through some of those media guides, but we'll get to that a bit later. Now, in your sophomore season at Marquette, you were named one of the co-captains of the team, and you had a winning record. You were 16-13. And you began averaging double-figure points as you would for the rest of your college career. As a junior, you then helped lead Marquette to an even better record, 20-8. And you were in the NCAA tourney as well and lost to Oklahoma State, which was led by, as you mentioned a little bit earlier, Bryant Big Country Reeves. Do you mind just talking about those couple of seasons there and that tournament itself?
Sure. Well, after the season we went through during my freshman year where we just kind of got the tar beat out of us by all the top teams in the country, I think the coaching staff reevaluated their scheduling strategies and they basically went to the RPI and started making calls from the bottom of the list and went up. And so I don't remember the specific teams from my sophomore season, but if you look at it, you'll probably see they weren't that good. There was a lot of directional schools like Southeast here, Northwest, whatever, and schools that most folks have never heard of. And maybe that helped build up our confidence a little bit. So that kind of got us on the winning track. And Marquette at that time, and I didn't realize this when I went there, I was kind of more naive, I guess, than I should have been. They'd won the championship in 1977, and I didn't know the difference between one school and the next. I was being recruited by UCLA and Arizona and Florida State. I thought Marquette was on par with all those schools, and they were certainly at one point, but the program had kind of fallen on hard times. And I know they were evaluating whether they even wanted to stay at the Division I level or not within a few years of when I went there. And Bill Cords was hired as the athletic director, hired Kevin O'Neill, who was an assistant at Arizona and was actually recruiting me at Arizona. He knew that there was a kind of unique talent window in Wisconsin during the time I was in high school and took the job and did a really good job of resurrecting the program. I don't think he'll ever get enough credit for it because of all the accomplishments of Dwayne Wade with Tom Crean, but that program is where it is today in large part because of the efforts of Bill Cords, the athletic director, and Coach O'Neill. I mean, they turned the corner and put the program going in the right direction. So I want to say in between my sophomore and junior year, we actually took a trip to Australia.
Okay.
You could do that once every 4 years with your program. You can do a summer trip, and we played in Australia, New Zealand, and Fiji. And that really helped us as well. Gel as a team, gain more confidence. We came in and weren't accustomed to the way they officiated basketball in Australia. And the first game we played, all but 6 guys fouled out by the end of the game. And it was the same way at the other team as well. And we weren't playing top-level Australian teams. I think they were kind of second-tier teams and had some former college players on them. And so we kind of made our way through our tour in Australia and hadn't lost, and then we got to the last game, and I think it was some kind of junior national team, and there was some shuffling of the roster, and because they didn't want us to leave the country, I guess, with a perfect record, and it ended up going into multiple overtimes. It was a really good team, and we ended up winning that, and then we went over to New Zealand, and we played the same team there for 2 games, and that was kind of bizarre because the New Zealand team had a Samoan point guard who was kind of high energy and had a short fuse, and we had a guy, Ron Curry, who was kind of a really high energy guy and wasn't going to get pushed around by anybody. And those 2 guys got into it and got into a fight. One of the officials started crying. He looked like he was 14 years old. We were surprised they were letting him officiate the game. We were blowing the team out at that point. The other officials said, "This is ridiculous. I'm going home." And one of the Samoans players' moms came out of the stand with a program rolled up, and she was trying to attack Coach O'Neill. It was just an all-out brawl. It was kind of, I'd never been around anything like that before. And Sean Marks, he's from New Zealand, isn't he?
Yeah, I believe so, yes.
Yeah, he was actually in his early teens. He was at the game. He told me about it at the Pete Newell Big Man Camp years later. He's like, "I remember that. You guys got into that huge fight." So there wasn't a ton of people at that game. We didn't think it would be that big of a deal. And it was a front page news in Auckland the next day. And it was all over the radio. And we were trying to do some shopping and pick up some sheepskin rugs and stuff like that. And we had our Marquette sweats on because we didn't think anybody knew what happened. And people were looking at us like we'd shot their dog. And so, we're playing the same team again the next night, and we get a call from, like, the U.S. consulate or something, and they said, "If you get into a fight tonight, they're not going to let you leave the country." and we were going to go to Fiji right after that. So we made sure we were on our best behavior. And again, we were playing the same team, and we show up, and like I said, there wasn't many people that went to the first game. It was sold out for the second game. And there was like armed guards there and everything. It was amazing. So we blew them out of the water again. Then we went to Fiji, and the only reason we went to Fiji is because we couldn't find a team to play in Tahiti. And there was some kind of NCAA rule about how many days you could spend in a country and play a game. And so we found a team in Fiji somehow, and we stayed at a really nice resort, drove across the island to get to this game. It was, I believe, at some kind of Catholic mission somewhere. And for the perspective of the time that this all took place, have you ever heard of the serial killer Jeffrey Dahmer?
Yes, I have, yes.
Okay, yeah, he's from Milwaukee, or at least he did all his terrible things in Milwaukee while we were in school. In fact, I'm almost positive I saw him walk past my apartment one time. He only lived a couple blocks from where we lived and was just off the Marquette campus.
Wow.
So we get to Fiji, and usually when we have to explain where Milwaukee is to folks, we say it's kind of north of Chicago, it's in the middle part of the country, and we get to Fiji, and because of the history of that island, they knew exactly where we were because Jeffrey Dahmer was really big news there because he was a cannibal. He wasn't just a serial killer. So that was interesting. We had a clinic in Fiji right before we played our game, and it was a really rundown gym. Not rundown, well, there was dirt all over the floor, and there was a guy walking around before the clinic pounding nails into the floor that had kind of risen up so nobody would get caught on the nails. And so we did this clinic, and a bunch of these guys in the clinic had a bunch of Michigan State practice gear on because apparently Michigan State had come through the year before and their last game, so they left those guys a bunch of practice gear.
Yeah.
We did the clinic, and then when we got ready to do the game, it turned out half the guys that were in the clinic learning how to play better were on the other team that we were playing against. So Father DiUlio was the president of the university at the time. He came on the trip with us. He actually did color commentary for Fiji TV. Somebody was up in the rafters with a camera, and they were filming the game, and Father DiUlio did the color commentary, and our coach knew that the score would get back to New Zealand, and he didn't like the way things went down there. So he said, we're only going to beat these guys by 10 because I want those guys in New Zealand to see the score and think that the team in Fiji is better than they are. They were an awful team, and so we actually had one of our managers played at the end of the game. We just taped a number on his T-shirt, and he played. We left them all our practice gear, and we literally rode the bus back to the resort in our spandex, gave them our shoes, our tank tops, our shorts, everything, and hung out with the tribal guys and had some kava afterwards and Fiji lager because apparently it's legal to drink there when you're not 21, or so I've been told. So we had a great time there, and that trip, I think, really galvanized that team, and in going into my junior year really helped propel us and get us up back into the NCAA tournament where we did see Bryant Reeves and Oklahoma State, and I think Doug Gottlieb might have been on that team as well as point guard. And I think Sean Sutton, Eddie Sutton's son, maybe was on that team as well, or it's hard to remember because we played Oklahoma State my freshman year. He was on one of those teams. I don't remember which one. But they had a good team. They beat us in Indianapolis, and then we got even better the next year. And really the turning point for us on the court was Tony Miller arriving on campus, and he was a kid that most folks weren't even recruiting for basketball. He was a really good quarterback, won a state championship in the state of Ohio, went to the same high school, St. Joe's, as Elvis Gerbach, who was a quarterback for University of Michigan. And nobody recruited him for basketball, even though he was actually a pretty talented point guard. After what we had gone through my freshman year with Rob Lagerman having to play point, it was Tony's team to run for the next 3 years when I was there and then the year after. But it was Kevin O'Neill really doing a great job of recruiting talent that a lot of other people overlooked. We had Will Gates on our team, who was the star of the movie Hoop Dreams, a documentary. And I'd actually known Will for several years. We played together at 5-Star, at Pitt 2 when we were both in high school. But Will had a teammate at his high school, Kevin also recruited, that nobody was really looking at. He was like 6'9", but needed a lot of work, and his name was Amal McCaskill, and obviously he turned into a pretty decent player, ended up playing in the NBA for a while. And then Kevin also brought in a guy, Chris Crawford, who had a major league arm on him and could have played baseball, but chose to play basketball instead, and Chris Crawford ended up playing in the NBA for quite a while. So Kevin not only had a really good eye for talent, but was able to identify players that not a lot of other coaches were really recruiting, and brought them into Marquette and really set the groundwork for that program to be good for several years after he left.
Yeah, definitely. Now, you've mentioned some really great things there as far as the backstory goes to how your team galvanised and came together in your junior and then in your senior seasons. And I'll get to the senior season in a moment where you went really well in the NCAA tourney. But it's great to hear that you've got a bit of a link there to Australia and then causing international incidents in New Zealand on your way to Fiji, and just some fantastic stuff there. So that was really cool to hear that sort of background there. And I'm glad you got out of New Zealand in one piece. Now,
just still have a sheepskin rug, too. It's held up really well.
I can imagine. Now, you did mention William Gates there for a moment. I think Hoop Dreams came out in the mid-1990s. It might have been just after or just as you were about to turn pro, somewhere like that. Would that be correct?
Yeah, they started when Will was in high school. In fact, my aunt, her aunt, some people pronounce that differently, lives in Chicago. She was his English teacher in high school.
Okay.
And he went to the same high school as Marty Clark, who played at Duke. I think that was also St. Joe's Westchester is the name of that school. And the original background on Hoop Dreams was that it was a multi-part TV documentary that was filmed for public television here in the States. Mm-hmm. And they ended up kind of condensing it and turning it into a movie. But the camera crew was around periodically. Like when Will got married and we all went down to the wedding, the crew was there for all of that. Kevin O'Neill made it into the movie, and my aunt made it into the movie, Mrs. Zayer, but I never did. It was really neat to see that, both with Will and Arthur, the other guy that they profiled, to see how those guys came along. And Will's actually back in Chicago. He's a preacher now and doing really well, but that was very critically acclaimed. I think it won an Oscar for Best Documentary or something like that. It was up for consideration if it didn't win, but really interesting to be around that and see Will's story unfold firsthand.
Yeah, that's true. And even here in Australia, I remember at the time, because I was a massive basketball fan back then, I was only maybe not even 20 just when that came out. And that was even big news here in Australia, the fact that the documentary was so fly on the wall. A look at the two guys trying to make their way into the pros, and really interesting. So that's an incredible link there that you have with the filming of that as well. Now, as a junior at Marquette, I also noticed that in one of the games you played against Northeastern Illinois, you lit up the scoring column with 36 points, and I think in the same game you had 13 blocked shots, if I'm correct. Do you have memories of that game?
Yeah, you don't forget games like that.
I'd think not, because that's an incredible stat line. So I just thought I'd ask to see what you remember of it. I think it's an all-time single game record as well for the total blocked shots in the game, at least for Marquette.
Yeah, it was for Marquette. I think David Robinson might have the single game for the NCAA record. But the question I got most after that game was, how come you couldn't get a triple-double? And I said I couldn't miss. I made just about every shot I took, and I had 36 points, so I couldn't get any offensive rebounds. And that was just one of those freakish games. I wish I could put in a bottle whatever made that happen. It was fun. I enjoyed it. And somebody just asked me the other day, because I think I have 399 career blocks at Marquette, how come I couldn't get that one more and get to the 400th? And I said, anytime you have a guy that's a really good shot blocker that has 300 or more block shots in his career, there's probably literally 50, 75, or 100 shots that he blocked that he'll never get credit for. And you can feel the ball hit your hand, and the ball comes up short on the rim or misses entirely and maybe just looks like an air ball. Those folks behind the table trying to keep track of all the stats are never going to catch everything. And sometimes when you're on the road, they're not going to catch everything because they don't want to pad your stats on the road, which you look at the NBA boxes, and I'm not saying there was any of that going on at the NBA level, but just look at the box scores in Utah for the opposing teams when they came in. Everybody had lots of assists in Utah. They gave out assists in Utah like they were candy. I had assists in Utah, and I never got assists. So some scorekeepers were more meticulous or more liberal with the way they kept track of things than others. But block shots, you're never going to get credit for every one that you have. And just know that, it's like Sean Bradley. For every shot he blocked, he probably blocked another one and probably disrupted two or three more. And that's just kind of standard.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that about your career titles, because I had a question I was going to ask you about the 399 career blocks, and had you tried to chase down any statisticians post-game to try and get that extra one to make it 400, because at a very elite group that would have 400 or more blocks, but that's an incredible effort. I think in your senior season, you had 142 out of maybe 198 team blocks, so you were very dominant, and obviously that helped go a long way towards earning that Defensive Player of the Year award for the NCAA Division I.
Yeah, I didn't think after my freshman year that I'd ever block that many shots again, because I thought teams would adjust and wouldn't allow me to have those opportunities. But apparently more than a few teams had the strategy that we'll just get the guy in foul trouble and then it won't be an issue. But I tried to avoid getting into foul trouble as much as I could. So I think I had fewer my sophomore year, but then my junior and senior year, my numbers went up a little bit. But we had a great statistician who still works the games, John Dodd, and he was probably as frustrated as anyone, because he'd watch the road games on TV and he'd see the block shots and you'd see the replays and you'd see the block shots on the replays, and then you look at the box score and they don't show up. And I'd get on the bus after the games and the coaches would look at me and say, "It says you only got 3 blocks here. You had like 7 blocks." And I said, "Yeah, that's kind of every game it's like that." And even last night we played, and I say we, I do the radio for Marquette University. Still, we were in Las Vegas and Marquette played New Mexico, and we looked at the assist numbers that they put down there for Marquette, and there's just no way that Marquette had as few assists as they claim they did, because they had 6 made three-pointers at one point and they only had 5 assists on the whole game. That's almost impossible. I guess I take those stats with a grain of salt sometimes, because I know there's so much that's missing from them sometimes. Even though I know those folks try their best to get all the numbers, it's hard to keep track because there's so much going on.
Yeah, very true. In particular with the block shots, aside from altering the shots, the ones you get a fingertip on or do disrupt, as you mentioned earlier, they often don't get credited. So obviously you would have probably got well into the 400s as far as career blocks go.
Yeah, so would everybody else, so it all evens out.
Now, as a senior, you were named the Great Midwest Conference Player of the Year. You averaged almost 14 points a game and had over 8 rebounds and as we said, over 4 blocks a game. And you made the Sweet 16 in the NCAA tourney, which is a fantastic effort, eventually losing out to Grant Hill and the Duke Blue Devils. The game prior, you upset third-seeded Kentucky Wildcats. So what are your memories of that senior season and more specifically even the NCAA tourney run?
Well, we had a really good team that year. They were good the year before, and we got even better. Really well balanced and really deep. We had a lot of, I guess in college basketball, they kind of sum up a career offensively. If you could score 1,000 points in 4 years or while you were in school, you had a pretty good run. And so Rob Lagerman, Damon Key, and myself were all 1,000-point scorers. Tony Miller was a 1,000-point scorer at the point guard position. Ronnie Eford was a 1,000-point scorer. Anthony Pieper, who was another shooting guard, was a 1,000-point scorer, and Chris Crawford was also as well. And I'm not sure if Amal made it to 1,000 or not, but we had at least 7 on that one team. So it was a really balanced team, really deep, and we probably had 7 or 8 guys on that team that were capable of scoring 20 points in a game if we needed them to. It was an unselfish team, and Tony Miller is still amongst the NCAA's all-time leaders in assists, in large part because we had so many guys on the team while he was there that were 1,000. I mean, Ron Curry, who graduated the year before, was a 1,000-point scorer between Marquette and Arizona. And not only that, but between myself and Ron Curry and Damon Key and Amal McCaskill, we were really high percentage shooters. Rob Lagerman was one of the Marquette's best three-point shooters of all time, and so Tony had a lot of options and a lot of guys who could score at a really high rate. So that played well for us, and I did get the Defensive Player of the Year, but my junior and senior year, we led as a team the NCAA in defensive field goal percentage. And sometimes I understand that wasn't always the most entertaining basketball to watch, especially when we played the Green Bay teams and the scores were literally in the 30s. But it was really effective for us. It worked really well. In fact, I think at one point we had set the NCAA record for defensive field goal percentage in the season. It might still be one of the top numbers overall as a team. And so it was really, I think what I was able to accomplish with block shots was due in large part to the way that we structured our defensive strategy, and it afforded me a lot of those opportunities to get some shots blocked.
How about the actual tournament itself, particularly the win over Kentucky and then also going up against Grant Hill and the Blue Devils in the Sweet 16? What about those experiences there, just briefly?
Well, it's ironic in a couple of ways. In high school, I was on an AAU team, and I know I'm getting off track a little bit. I was on an AAU team with Damon Key, and we also had Calvin Rayford, who played at Kansas, and Larry Heisel Jr., who played at Wisconsin. Basically, everybody on our AAU team ended up playing Division I basketball. We played the first basketball game ever in Tampa Bay, and at the time they called it the Suncoast Dome, and I believe it's where the Devil Rays play now. And it was kind of a full circle thing, and in that game we actually played against Chris Webber's AAU team, who I think we beat. It was in the national tournament. We beat them earlier in the tournament, but it was a double elimination, and they beat us down there. So we went back down to Tampa and played the 2 games down there on the first weekend and beat like Northeast Louisiana or somebody like that. And then we had Kentucky in the second round, and Rick Pitino was coaching, and Travis Ford was the point guard, who I actually just ran into last night in Las Vegas because he's coaching Oklahoma State right now. And I should have known he was going to be out there. It was surreal. I just saw him in the hallway. I said, "Travis, how you doing?" He acted like he remembered me. Maybe he did. I don't know. That was a pretty good Kentucky team. They had Roderick Rhodes and a couple other guys. Walter McCarty, I think, was on that team. And they were just moving past that era where they had been hit with a bunch of NCAA sanctions, and Pitino came in and were kind of rebuilding it. Earlier in that season, they were down maybe 30 points against LSU at some point and won. They came back and beat LSU. And we had a really strong first half against them, and Tony Miller was just playing phenomenal basketball. And we came out after halftime, and they came out with just, a couple minutes before the second half. And usually, I guess folks never think about this when they're watching games, but usually as players, when you come out after you've played a half of basketball, if you know you've done pretty well and the other team hasn't, and they're late getting to the court, you just figure they're in the locker room getting chewed out by their coach.
Yep.
And so we thought that's what was going on with Kentucky, and we didn't know. And then they came out with just a couple minutes before the second half started, and they seemed like they didn't have a care in the world. And so we kind of got together in our huddle saying, they think we're LSU Part 2, and they're just going to roll over us in the second half. And we actually got really mad by just their body language and warm-ups before the second half. Tony Miller carried us the whole game, and Kentucky was known for their full-court pressure, and Tony Miller said, as soon as I get the ball, just clear out and give me some room to operate, and he broke down their press just by himself. We ended up beating Kentucky, which was, I don't know if it was a big upset, but it was certainly an upset at the time, and we got to stick around for another weekend, and we went to Knoxville, ironically enough, to play against Duke. And I think if we had beaten Duke, we would have played against Glenn Robinson's Purdue team in the Elite Eight. So we go down to Knoxville, and it's ironic because Kevin O'Neill, the previous season, because we got into 20 wins in the NCAA tournament, had become a hot commodity in coaching talks about moving from one school to another. And he was pretty honest with us and told us schools were looking at him, but he didn't want to go anywhere and was just going to use it to try to get more money from Marquette so we could fly charter a little bit more and get some nicer things and get the program running more like it was at Arizona, where he'd come from, and they had a lot of success with guys like Sean Elliott and Brian Williams and that whole crew. We got into my senior year, and we were doing even better than the year before, and Kevin's name was being mentioned for every job in the country. And one of them was the University of Tennessee, where we actually were playing what ended up being our final game. So it was a bit ironic that we were down there. And we played Duke hard and hung with them the whole game. They had Cherokee Parks on that team, as well as Grant Hill and Marty Clark, Eric Meeks. We just didn't have enough in the tank at the end to get past them. But it felt like for most of that game that we'd have a good chance of beating them. So, again, kind of full circle. First collegiate game was against Duke in the last one, which I guess the last one is how a lot of teams end up with all the success that Duke has had over the years. But it was a really good run, and enjoyed the heck out of it, and still see a lot of those guys and talk to them to this day.
Yeah, some lifelong memories, no doubt. And for what it's worth, early on in the game against Duke, after I rewatched part of it last night before we chatted today, you blocked Cherokee Parks, and then legendary commentator Bill Raftery said, and I quote, although I won't try and do his voice, he said, "Jim's amazing, the eraser, the window washer." So he certainly getting into it, and one of the great commentators, and that was on the back of a great block shot on Cherokee Parks.
The funny thing about Raph, he did a lot of our games when I was playing for the Nets, and so he'd be on the team bus with us with Ian Eagle, and as soon as I saw him for the first time when he got onto our team bus, I had to go up to him and give him a hard time because when I was at 5-Star Camp, have you ever heard of 5-Star?
Yeah, I have indeed.
Okay. Yeah, that was like anybody who was anybody in the NBA, from Michael Jordan, Patrick Ewing, all those guys, they all went to 5-star. And I was fortunate enough to have a great AAU coach in Rick Cobb who kind of knew the way things operated at that point. And we were in that first generation of AAU basketball players, and our whole team went out to 5-star for a week and played out there. And while we were out there were kids out there that were our age that were tape recording games on audio, and they were doing play-by-play and color commentary. And so finally I talked to one of these kids, and I said, "What are you doing?" He said, "I'm in Bill Raftery's broadcasting camp." I said, "What?" He's like, "Yeah, Bill Raftery runs a broadcasting camp, and so we record these games, and then Raf listens to them and gives us recommendations and suggestions and this and that." And so I went up to Raf on the bus. I said, "What kind of scam were you running with kids in a broadcasting camp in summer league?" And he's like, it was just kind of a fun deal, and Raf knows all the angles. So it was kind of cool that he did that, and really fun to have him as a broadcaster for the Nets games for so many years. In fact, I'm reasonably positive, I know I was on the team, I think I was playing in the game when he came up with the catchphrase "onions."
All right.
Because, I think that was a game that Johnny Newman had when he was with the Nets, and he was just killing it. And he mentioned it to Ian Eagle, and if you end up Googling it after the interview, I think you'll find the backstory on it was Johnny Newman was just playing out of his mind, and Raf said, "Johnny Newman's got big onions," and Ian Eagle's like, what are you talking about? And I think off the air, Raf explained it to him, but that's, I think, where that came from.
Oh, that's a classic. And you mentioned Iron Eagle there. He's been a former guest on this show as well. I've had him on, luckily for me, he's been on twice, but maybe unlucky for him, he's been on twice, but he's a great guy as well. So, really interesting that you have that link there as well from your future NBA days as well. So, pretty cool. Now, your final game was against the Duke Blue Devils, as you said. You would then enter the NBA draft in 1994. Just before we actually get to the draft itself, a semi-random question. You wore number 34 when you were in college, and then number 22 in the pros. I've got a weird fascination with the reasoning behind jersey numbers. Is there a background to your choices?
Okay, so my hero in high school was a guy named Mark Scott, who was 3 years ahead of me at St. Catherine's. I'm the second best center named Jim from my high school. I don't know if you knew that or not, but Jim Chones also played at my high school years before me, who ended up playing at Marquette and won a championship with the Lakers, played with the Cleveland Cavaliers for several years. So I wore 34 because Mark Scott wore 34. And then when I got to Marquette, Tony Smith had graduated the year before, and he wore 34. And so that number was available, and I took it and then wore that all the way through Marquette. And then Don McIlvaine, who actually hung out with me on my visit at UCLA, had 34 when I got to the Bullets. So 34 wasn't available, and so I picked 22 for a couple of different reasons. One was because I was the second pick in the second round of the draft that year for the Bullets, and then the other is that 22 is Jimmy Buffett's high school number. If that sounds believable, that's the honest truth. That's how I ended up with that number.
Oh, that's awesome. I didn't know about the other Jim that you were talking about, but I love the story behind former players, how they come up with their numbers. And I was trying to find out what the link was. I was looking at your date of birth. I was looking at where you went, but I didn't actually think second pick, second round. So that's pretty cool how it worked out. Good to know that. So speaking of the NBA draft, were you in attendance there, or were you watching it offsite?
I was off-site. I had worked out for a bunch of teams. I think maybe Portland, who drafted Aaron McKee that year, had the highest pick that I worked out for, and they told me if Aaron wasn't available, they were going to draft me, which floored me because I never anticipated I could go that high in the draft. I worked out with Golden State, Cleveland, Miami, Milwaukee Bucks had the 18th pick. They picked Eric Mobley, and I was invited to come down to the Bradley Center. I didn't think I'd get picked by the Bucks. There were a lot of other guys before me that had gone through the draft. Latrell Sprewell, Nick Van Exel were a couple of them, Tony Smith, and the Bucks seemed to have a reputation for never drafting guys with Wisconsin ties, at least up until that point. So I didn't want to go there. My agent was based out of Cincinnati, Ron Grinker, who anybody who complains about my contract will follow that up by saying McIlvaine had the best agent of all time, and I can't disagree. He told me to get a hotel room, actually 2 hotel rooms, so there was 2 phone lines, one that I could talk to the team or the media or whoever, and then one that I could just talk to him directly. And so he said, if you get drafted by the Bucks, make it close to Milwaukee so you can drive in and go to do a press conference, but if not the Bucks, then you don't have to worry about being being that morning star guy who comes to the draft and ends up being like the second to last pick in the whole draft, and you're sitting there in a suit and tie waiting, and your name never gets called. So, I did that, and the Knicks wanted me to come in the day of the draft and work out. They had, I think, the last 2 picks in the first round. They got Charlie Ward and Monty Williams. My agent didn't want to do that, so I didn't go in and work out for them, and he seemed to have a pretty good feel for where I was going to go. And then when I didn't get picked and I moved into the second round, he's like, I don't know what's going to happen now. And I ended up getting picked by the Bullets, which was kind of a surprise. But as soon as I did, he said, that's a really good place for you because they've got 2 big guys right now, George Mirasan and Kevin Duckworth. And Kevin's at the end of his career, and he's battling weight issues and probably won't be able to stay healthy the whole season. And George Mirasan is 7'7", and his body's not going to be able to hold up. And you're going to get some time on that team between those 2 guys. And as it turned out, George's body held up amazingly well the 2 years I was there, and it wasn't until the end of my second year that I actually got a bunch of minutes to get out on the court and play.
Yeah, well, around that same time, I think George Mirasan was also the most improved player from one season to the next, wasn't he, when you were there?
Yeah, he was. He got most improved player. I can't remember if it was my rookie year or my second year, but he was playing really good basketball, probably shooting over 60% from the floor, and had a really soft touch, knocked down free throws, and there's nothing you can do when a guy is 7'7". You can double team, but 2 guys can't get at the ball just as easily as one guy can't. So he was one of the toughest guys I ever had to defend, whether he was on my team or I was playing against him, because double teams are ineffective. You can pass out of the double teams. You can shoot over double teams. You can play keep away with the ball, and you really have to commit yourself if you're going to try to knock the ball away. And if you do, he might just duck past you and score.
Yeah, no, he has definitely a huge body on top of the 7'7" height. So, yeah, offered numerous challenges to guard for sure. Now, in your first season with the Bullets, the team struggled and went 21-61, and you had a really eclectic mix of personalities on that roster, including some of the ones you've mentioned, like Kevin Duckworth and George Mirasan. But you also had 2 former Fab Fivers in Juwan Howard and Chris Webber, Tom Gugliotta, Kenny Skywalker, Rex Chapman, great players like that as well. So how did you find the chemistry of the team, particularly when you were struggling with that losing record?
It was a challenge for me because I wasn't accustomed to losing. In college, when you lose, you're like in this major depression until the next game when you get a chance to get that monkey off your back and shake it. And I wasn't used to going to the NBA where you're playing 82 games a year and you kind of mourn the loss for a little bit but then move on, and you're on the bus, not even on the plane, but on the bus going to the airport, and guys are already starting to laugh and playing cards. And I'm like, we just lost. Yeah, we got a game tomorrow night. Rook, don't worry about it. So that was a little bit of an adjustment for me, but I had great teammates in Washington, and I still keep in touch with several of those guys. In fact, George Mirasan I see almost every time I go to D.C. for Marquette games, and his son and my son played at 5-Star in Louisville together last summer, and we'll probably play at 5-Star camps together again next summer. And Mitchell Butler, Doug Overton were on those teams, great guys. Like you said, Tom Gugliotta and Juwan and I got drafted together, and it was kind of, I think, a relief for both of us because we were nervous about going from college to the NBA. And Juwan and I had known each other since high school. My AAU team actually played in the City League in Chicago. We'd drive an hour and a half each week to go down and play basketball in Chicago. And so I'd known Juwan for several years through that. And he and I both kind of talked to each other when we came in for the press conference and said, it's nice that I at least know one guy on the team. I made fast friends with a lot of the other guys. Kenny Walker actually lived with Rex Chapman that season. Okay. And, they were thick as thieves and always cracking people up and really funny guys and great to be around. But, when it came time to go on the court, Rex was ready. He was battling injuries at that point. And Tony Kornheiser and Michael Wilbon were pretty much local in D.C. at that point and had kind of a round table show, and I think Tony Kornheiser called it the curse of the Bullet, that no matter how good the team was and all the great players, Calbert Cheney or whoever else we had on the team, we were always going to end up having guys get hurt. And I think after the first 30 games, he said, they're going to be 10-20 or whatever, and I think our second year we did better than that. And I made, Kornheiser admit that he had to eat his words, but great guys and a lot of fun, and the coaching staff was phenomenal. Jimmy Lynam and Derek Smith, who is like an older brother to me. I miss him to to this day. That's actually Nolan Smith's father. Derek Smith we call them Grinker guys. Anybody who was represented by my agent was a Grinker guy, and Derek Smith was a Grinker guy. And so when I got drafted by Washington, in a lot of ways it was a big relief because my agent said, Derek's going to take great care of you, and Derek worked out with me all the time. Before games, after practices, always did a lot of extra work with me, and I just loved him to death. And that was the hardest part about leaving Washington, was leaving Jimmy Lynam and Derek Smith, because I loved those guys as coaches, and they had confidence in me. And in the NBA, so much of, I think, a player's ability to succeed is based on the confidence that his coaches and his teammates have in him when he goes onto the court. And those guys really believed in me, and I think really helped me blossom as a player. So it was a great experience to be with those guys, and I fortunately got a chance to be with Jimmy again later in my career in New Jersey because John Nash was the GM who drafted me in Washington, and he ended up going to work for the Nets, and he kind of executed the trade that brought me from Seattle to New Jersey.
Oh, yeah, great. Now, so you mentioned some great names there in terms of those coaches as well that you were fortunate to form good relationships with that went forward as well, and some great names there with Rex Chapman and Kenny Walker, both former big-time dunkers as well. So I'm sure that any chance they had to throw down a big dunk also was probably appreciated by most of the guys on your roster.
It was, but the thing about it, they were both kind of getting near the end of their careers. Rex ended up going out to Phoenix and playing a couple more years and doing pretty well out there. But in terms of their springs, their legs, they were reaching that point in their careers. Kenny especially were, and that might have been Kenny's last year. They knew they didn't have it in them anymore. Their knees were giving them a hard time, and they were having a hard time jumping like they once did, and it's nice to be around guys like that who are so open with what's going on with their bodies, because it kind of gives you a window into your own future, knowing that your body's not going to last the way you think it's going to for the rest of your life. In fact, Joe Wolf was a guy who told me, like my rookie year, he said, I'm just wondering when I'm going to need my first hip replacement. I said, Joe, you've never hurt your hip. He looked at me like, you don't think you're not going to need hip replacements? Because all that wear and tear you're putting on your body, even if you never hurt your hips are going to get worn out, man. And that never occurred to me. But the NBA was just a really neat experience for me. And Mr. Grinker, he was my agent, but he was really a father figure, and he represented a lot of great guys: Craig Elo, Danny Manning, Danny Shays, Cornbread Maxwell. We had our own little camp before training camp in Cincinnati where all of Mr. Grinker's players would come in, and so just going into training camp as a rookie, you felt a little more prepared because you had those guys on your team, and Mr. Grinker knew all the tricks about the NBA as well. And so like the standard player contract, you had a free hotel room on all the road games based on double occupancy. And so in the NBA, nobody wants a roommate because, hey, we're in the NBA and I'm going to, pick up some girl at a club or whatever. I'm just an adult. I don't have roommates anymore, whatever the mentality was. Yeah. So Mr. Grinker said, request a roommate because no one else is going to want a roommate. And then you're going to get your own room, and they're going to have to pay $5,000 a year to have their own room, and yours is going to be free because you said you wanted a roommate. So he literally knew all the angles. And so I'm in Summer League, and at that point, the Bullets hadn't offered me a contract. I was their draft pick, so I had to play for them, and if it worked out, great. If it didn't, I'd try to find another team. And Anthony Tucker, who had played for Coach Stack at Wake Forest, was my roommate in Summer League. And so I'm telling him all these things that my agent is explaining to me. He's like, that's really, they charge you $5,000 a year for your hotel room? I'm like, yeah, if you want your own room, they do. And at that point, Tucker didn't think that he'd make the Bullets. He thought he was just going to be there to get seen by other teams and try to make it onto a roster in somebody else's camp. So they invited Anthony Tucker back to camp, and Anthony Tucker and I both made the team, and we both requested roommates, and so we were roommates for our rookie year, probably the last roommates at the NBA level in NBA history. And the other guys, honestly, they looked at us like, so you guys, are you gay? And they were serious. They're like, why would you want each other as roommates? And Anthony Tucker was making league minimum, and I was making barely above league minimum. $5,000 was a lot of money for us, anyway. Yeah. And we explained, no, it's you're paying $5,000 at the end of the season for your own hotel room. And a couple of the guys were like, what, really? Yeah, yes, you are. And so then they didn't go get roommates, but they were kind of. They understood better at that point why we ended up not minding having roommates. And I was just out of college where you had to have a roommate anyway, so it wasn't that big of an adjustment for me. And Tucker wasn't that far behind me. He was a young guy as well, so it wasn't that big of a deal to have a roommate. and we both appreciated having an extra $5,000 in our pocket when the season came to an end.
Yeah, that's a classic with the tricks of the trade there to suggest asking for a roommate and how you ended up getting paired together. So, yeah, that's a funny story there. Now, in your second season with the Bullets in 1996, you just missed the playoffs. You went 39-43, and you were top 10 in the NBA with 2.1 blocks a game, incredibly in just under 15 minutes a game. A fantastic achievement just there. In your opinion, what do you think actually led the improvement and the near 500 record from one season to the next?
Well, we had really good players on the team. Rasheed Wallace was a rookie on that team. Brent Price was playing really well. Tim Legler was playing really well. Both of those guys were amongst the league leaders in three-point percentage, and Mark Price was on that team. So it was neat to be around both the Price brothers. And that, in terms of camaraderie, I think that was one of my all-time favorite teams. Every road trip, Brent Price and Tim Legler and I would go out and have dinner, and we'd go see a movie. Sometimes we'd drag Mark Price along, which is kind of awkward because you go into the mall that's attached to the hotel in Cleveland, and there's like a 3-story tall mural of Mark Price from when he was a Cavalier in the mall in like the common area where you're eating. And it's surreal to be sitting next to the guy whose mural is up on that wall. And then we go see a movie, and we're trying to pick out different movies because you're on the road a lot and you're seeing a bunch of movies, and we're not going to go out to the clubs and drink or anything. And so Brent Price and Tim Legler and I were big movie buffs, and Mark was kind of not an introvert, but kind of a private guy and didn't want to get hassled, especially when you go to certain towns where he's really well known, like Cleveland. But I remember one road trip we talked him into going to a movie with us, and I'd seen Desperado, which was directed by Robert Rodriguez, and I somehow talked the guys into going to see From Dusk Till Dawn. And I don't know if you've seen that movie or not.
Yeah, I know the one you're talking about. Yeah.
Yeah, it's kind of a bizarre movie, and both the Price brothers are very Christian guys and very godly. And so we go to the movie, and we didn't think Mark was going to join us because he didn't always do that. But Brent and Tim and I headed down to the movie, and we're sitting together in one row, and then Mark shows up right before the movie starts and sits behind us. And I'm like, wow, Mark actually came to the movie. And, you proceed to watch this comedy action vampire movie where people are getting stabbed and blood's flying everywhere. And I'm sitting there thinking, I can only imagine what goes through Mark Price's mind when he watches stuff like this. And so as soon as the movie ends, all three of us kind of turn around to look at Mark and see what he thought of the movie. He'd left, not even 10 minutes into the movie. He'd seen enough and just took off. But that was really fun. I enjoyed hanging out with those guys. And George Mirasan would come out with us. But, again, the same thing with George. He'd get hassled so much. It was hard for him to even get through a meal without people bothering him. And that's where I really understood, the problem that the really famous guys have, that it's important enough for somebody else to interrupt your meal to get an autograph, but it's not important enough for them to interrupt their own meals. They're going to hit you on the way out from when they're done eating, but they don't want to get up from the middle of their meal to go talk to you when you're first sitting down. So those guys didn't go out as much, but that in terms of team camaraderie, I think the wives got along really well together and hung out a lot, and it was more like what Kevin Duckworth described the Portland Trail Blazers team like. Because when I first got to Washington, Duck was kind of, great guy, great heart, but he had weight issues that he was battling, and I've been around on a couple teams, and I've probably been that guy on at least the Nets where everybody's looking at him, and how animals are when one's sick and dying, everybody else kind of keeps their distance. So guys kind of kept their distance from Duck, but I had him over to the house to eat dinner, and we got to be pretty good friends. And he said, when I was in Portland, we hung out together all the time, on the court, off the court. And sure enough, Houston came to Washington when Clyde Drexler was there and played a game down there. And after the game, Houston was staying, and my buddies from grade school and high school had just driven a car out to Maryland for me that I was leasing. They came to the game, and I was going to go out to eat with them, and Duck's like, no, bring them along with us. I said, you guys want to go out to eat with me and Duck? And they're like, yeah, sure. And next thing they know, they're sitting down at dinner. There's probably a dozen people around the table, and they're having dinner sitting right next to Clyde Drexler, and it's just blowing their mind. And he's like the nicest guy in the world, and it's blowing my mind, too. I had him on my poster on my bedroom wall when I was in high school.
Yeah.
And here I am having dinner with the guy, and sweetheart of a man. But that's the kind of cool stuff that happened in the NBA that really made the experience special for me was to be around all those guys. You know, to have Bill Walton come up and introduce himself to me like he even needed to do that. It's like, come on, you're Mr. Walton. You don't need to tell me who you are. And I was probably the youngest member in the history of the retired NBA players, but I love hanging out with those guys and learning from them. Not just about basketball stuff, but life after basketball. And I've been an active member in the Retired Players Association since the day I retired.
That was going to be one of my follow-up questions down the track, was that you've been a lifetime member of the NBRPA, and I was going to say, can you even put into words the feeling of being in the same room and conversing with these guys and just some of the absolute greats of the game? I mean, you've almost alluded to it there with Bill Walton, and I guess you've almost got to pinch yourself to say, well, I was at the highest level and in the top 400 players in the world during the course of my career, and yeah, it just must be an incredible feeling.
You know, you learn some stuff from the guys that they'd never admit to you when they were playing. And I know you're a big Michael Jordan fan. Tony Smith told me a story about Michael Jordan. He was at a game or something, and he was having to guard Michael. And Michael started complimenting Tony at the beginning of the game, like, oh, you're a really good player. I watched you at Marquette, and you did this and that. And you know, the switch gets flipped at that point, where it's like, holy cow. This is Michael Jordan, the best basketball player on the face of the earth, and he knows who I am, and he's complimenting me and telling me what a great player I am. And it was all psychological, you know, because suddenly your head's not in the game anymore. You're thinking about how Michael Jordan knows that you exist. and I had other guys doing that to me as well, who, you know, Patrick Ewing and Hakeem Olajuwon, guys I really looked up to who were very nice and complimentary. And I don't know if they were always doing it with the same intent that Michael Jordan did, where he was basically getting in your head in a really nice way to throw you off your game. But it had that effect sometimes where you just have to focus. And it's hard because these are guys that you grew up idolizing. Now you're playing against them. And now I get to hang out with them at these retired meetings. I'll never forget the first time I met Don Kojas, who was an All-American at Marquette and played many years for the Lakers. And he was on a bus, and I didn't know him from anybody else. And, you know, everybody at these retired players meetings, because we're kind of getting into 3 or 4 different generations of NBA players. They, you know, whether you're at the All-Star game or going on a tour somewhere during a summer meeting, everybody just starts introducing themselves to each other. And so Don shakes my hand and says, I'm Don Kojas, and my immediate response was, I thought you were dead. Because, you know, I'd seen him in the record books at Marquette, and his numbers hanging up in the rafters there, but you never heard from him again. And he lives in San Diego. He's doing great. He runs a children's camp out there, and just a phenomenal guy. I met his son. He brought his son along to these things and actually got to know him quite well. And what a great guy. And Maurice Lucas, miss him quite a bit. He was another Marquette guy that would go to these retired players meetings. So that was really special for me. Butch Lee, who was on the championship team at Marquette in 1977. And when we had our meeting in Puerto Rico, he lives in Puerto Rico. He's on their national team. Somebody actually called him when we got to Puerto Rico and said, Butch, you know all the guys are here and we're having a meeting at the hotel. Why don't you come on over? And it was, you know, like a 10-minute drive for him. And he didn't even realize the meeting was happening down there. So he came over. And so I got to meet Butch Lee. And it's cool. It's cool being around those guys, you know, hanging out with Bill Walton in the Ghost Bar in Las Vegas, you know, for a private retired players only party. And I look forward to those meetings every summer, and every time I miss one, I'm very disappointed by it, because these are guys that are the game itself. And there's a guy named Moose who played in the first NBA game ever, and I met him at my first meeting. He was in a wheelchair at that point. But there he was. You know, he played in the first NBA game back in, the 1940s. And I actually got to meet that guy. And George Mikan, I saw him at a meeting. It's like, you're George Mikan. Every post player since George Mikan was at DePaul has been taught the Mikan drill. And you associate the name with him. And if you don't know who he is, you eventually find out what a great player was. And here I am. I got to meet George Mikan. So that's been a great experience for me. And I always encourage retired players when I see them to go to those meetings, because you never know who you're going to run into. And a lot of times it's former teammates, and whether it's college or NBA, and it's just a great time. And we love it. My wife enjoys going, and just getting to spend time with somebody like Mark Eaton, who I watched a lot as a kid growing up, and getting to pick his brain a little bit about what he does after basketball ends. It's fun. And my wife says it's nice to hang out with tall people too, because my wife is 6'7", and you feel really normal when you hang out with a bunch of former NBA players, because everybody's 6'5" or taller, and all these tall clubs are all over the world, but they let just about anybody in. Like women under 6 feet, guys under 6'5", and that's the retired NBA players is the tall club because they're all tall, and I think it's fun for all those guys to be in that environment and be around all those legends.
Yeah, really well said there. And I love what the NBRPA does for the former players. And, well, speaking of the height, Mark Eaton's about 7'4" as well. So not too many people would perhaps dwarf you even at 7. You're 7'1", aren't you?
Yep.
Yeah, so at 7'4", Mark Eaton actually makes you feel a little bit small too, just for a small amount of time anyhow. But yeah, what a great thing that the association does. And also it's appropriately named Legends of Basketball because, as you said, you've got players going right back from the first NBA games through, George Mikan and beyond, up to just the more recently retired players. So it does a great thing there. So yeah, really well said.
Yeah, I guess maybe I'm at the height where I don't feel like anybody makes me feel short. But I would say when I'm around Mark and when I'm around George and some of these other really tall guys, it just makes me feel normal.
Yeah,
and it's a nice thing to feel normal.
Yeah, I can understand that. So after those 2 seasons with the Bullets, you signed as a free agent with the Seattle Supersonics. Now, it likely goes without saying that this NBA contract probably received more than its fair share of criticism or discussion. Probably the understatement of the decade, I suppose, as far as you're concerned. If it's not too personal, do you mind just perhaps talking about the events that led up to the negotiations and just the move from Washington to Seattle in general? If you prefer not to, then just by all means tell me.
I've never shied away from talking about it. Like I said earlier, I had anticipated that George Mirasan and Kevin Duckworth or one or the other would have some kind of injury, and you hate to wish that on anybody, but you looked at their bodies and said there's no way they can make it through an NBA season without having to take some time off here or there. Mm-hmm. But it wasn't really until like the last 10 games or so of my second season in Washington that I had an opportunity to play extended minutes beyond 10 or 15 minutes here or there. And in those last 10 games of the season, we played the Bulls, we played the Sonics, some of the top teams in the league, and I had really good games against those guys. I came not too far away from a triple-double against Chicago somehow. And, it was just that even though I'd been in the league for 2 years, even though I'd had 4 years of college basketball where any scout in the world could evaluate me, that small sample size of those 10 games really opened a lot of people's eyes and really shot up my value in the market. And again, going back to Mr. Grinker, he knew how the system worked, and there were guys who were drafted the same year as me who were inking 5, 7, 10-year deals. And Washington, my rookie year, had offered me a 3-year contract with the first year guaranteed, and Mr. Grinker said, I want you to sign a 1-year deal, even if it means less money. And so I did. And so then my second year, I was a restricted free agent. He didn't want me in Washington because he didn't feel that franchise was committed to winning and committed to attracting free agents and retaining talented players. And I can't disagree with him when we're practicing at Bowie State University and a gym Bowie State didn't want to use, and ceiling tiles are falling on the court during practice. And, one of 3 showers worked and the toilets were suspect. And so it was a situation where I loved the teammates, loved the coaches. I loved a lot of people that worked for the franchise, but in terms of the investment in the franchise, and there's a really lengthy story in it. When Michael Jordan left from management there, I got a phone call. I was out on the Hot Rod Magazine Power Tour, and somebody from one of the Washington newspapers was calling me, and at that point they'd already talked to Tim Legler and a lot of other guys and were just asking me to confirm some of the things that had gone on there, like, were you really supposed to pay the managers to wash your practice gear? Because that's just, it would seem absurd. It's like, well, they try to get you to do that, but I wouldn't do that. I just tipped them at the end of the year. So, little stuff like that. So after my first year, I signed an offer sheet with the Minnesota Timberwolves, and my agent tried to put in conditions that Washington wasn't going to meet, and one of them was indoor parking because Chris and Juwan were the only guys who had indoor parking at the US Air Arena, and everybody at Minnesota had indoor parking because they had enough room for all the cars, I guess. So that was one of the conditions. As a restricted free agent, the Bullets had like 2 weeks or whatever to match the offer. They fought some of the conditions that Minnesota with Kevin McHale had thrown in there and gotten some of them tossed out, and then it ended up being that they only had to match the dollar amount. And so they waited for the very last part of the 2 weeks and matched it, and I ended up going back to Washington, but I missed most of training camp because of how long it took to get the offer sheet matched. So after my second year, the rules of the NBA at the time were if you've gone through 2 contracts, you become an unrestricted free agent. And my agent knew that. And so some of these other guys that had locked into these long-term deals didn't know the cycle of contracts and what the free agent market was going to be from one year to the next, because apparently their agents weren't that bright, or just that wasn't on their radar. They were thinking about how much money they can make on this guy now.
Mm-hmm.
And my agent kind of looked at the big picture and said, after your second season, there's going to be a lot of salary cap room available and a lot of teams, a lot of good teams looking for players, and you really want to be an unrestricted free agent that year. So that was all kind of set in place my rookie year in terms of the strategy with one-year contracts. And Minnesota wanted to offer me a multi-year contract, and my agent said, no, we want a one-year contract. We want to be an unrestricted free agent. And so I was after my second year, and it was really Adam Keefe's contract in Utah that my agent used to drive the price on my contract, because Adam Keefe had just signed a fairly lucrative contract in Utah, and my agent's logic was Adam Keefe is a power forward, Jim's a center. Centers are far harder to come by in the NBA. So Jim needs to make more than Adam Keefe made, and we want a max deal in terms of years, 7 years, starting at $3 million a year, going up 20% a year, which was what was allowed in the league at that time.
Mm-hmm.
And Washington, their initial reaction was, we're going to offer him a 3-year deal, like $1 million, $1.5 million, $2 million, and he'll be lucky if he gets anything better than that. We wanted to be loyal to Washington and give them an opportunity. And I think they had just fired John Nash, and so we weren't dealing with John anymore. And we said, are you sure that's the best you can do? They said, that's the absolute best we can do. So, okay, then we'll talk to other teams. And Seattle came calling, and Houston and Boston couldn't offer as much money. Houston ended up signing Brent Price. Juwan ended up signing with Miami, which later got voided. And as I looked at the team that was in Washington, I really wanted to play with those guys because I really thought we had the opportunity to do some really good things. Rashid was, getting his temper under control and was going to be a phenomenal player in the league. Chris Webber was there. It was going to be good, but then guys started leaving. Robert Pack was gone. Mark Price was gone. Brent Price was gone. Tim Legler had blown his knee out, and who knows how long it was going to be before he came back around. And then when Juwan left, it's like everything that we'd seen from how the franchise was run, from making all the players park at a park and ride where you have to pay when you're on the road. Nobody else does that in the league. To asking to pay the managers to do their jobs instead of, So we thought that was what they were doing with the roster, and they were just going to let the team get gutted. And so we started looking around, and Cleveland and Seattle came and talked to me, and Seattle, Wally Walker said, what's the numbers? And my agent told me, said, okay, let's do it. And apparently they'd been really impressed when Seattle had played us in Washington, and some of the guys on the team made the comment that that's the kind of player that does those kinds of things. That's who we need to get us, to the next level. And so they seem to have some consensus there, although George Karl later told me, he wanted to have Bison Daly, Brian Williams instead of me. And I respected that. I appreciated that George was always honest with me. I wasn't his type of player. And I didn't, for as much as my agent knew about the business, I don't think he understood the relationship that George and Wally had and how contentious it was. And I kind of got caught in the middle of that. And had I known what was going on with those two, I don't know that I would have picked Seattle again, although I loved the experience, loved the franchise, loved the Ackerleys and the teammates and the city. It was a great time out there, and I still go out there every year for Detlef's golf outing. It was kind of a deal between George and Wally that I found myself in the middle of after the fact, and it kind of hung around me the whole time I was out there. But it was what the market would bear, and it wasn't even Cleveland offered me more money, which they ended up giving to Zydrunas Ilgauskas, and then Washington ended up, when they were losing everybody else, they offered me more money than Cleveland. And for me, at that point, with the dollar amounts they were talking about, it really wasn't about the money. It was Seattle had just been in the championship the year before, and I really wanted to win an NBA championship. And I looked at the guys on that team, and I wanted to go there and try to win a championship because Steve Scheffler was also a Grinker guy. He was on that team. And, again, the benefit of having an agent like Mr. Grinker, he makes sure that you have regular contact with his other clients. So you're able to talk and compare notes. And Steve tells me how the Seattle Sonics run things. And he didn't show me the scouting report on our team, but he showed me the scouting report from another team that they were playing. And I'm like, you're kidding me. You guys get scouting reports? We got these in college. I didn't think they did that in the NBA. He's like, Oh no, they do, and they showed it to me, and they had individual tendencies on each player, and they had all the plays broken down, and it really spoke to the quality of George Karl's staff with Terry Stotts and Dwayne Casey and all those guys with Tim Gergerich, who I still think is like the best assistant of all time in the NBA. They really did their homework, and it showed on the court, and that was, the preparation was one of the reasons that those teams are so good. We had nothing like that in Washington. And when I got to New Jersey, we had nothing like that in New Jersey. And I was bringing my scouting reports from the year before from the Sonics with me and sharing them with the guys when we were playing other teams, because a lot of the personnel was still the same, and they had tendencies. This guy turns over his left shoulder 65% of the time, and his right shoulder 35% of the time, and they just didn't have that anywhere else that I had played. They had it at other teams in the league that I'd come to find out. But when you hear about the way the Sonics operated, you want to be a part of that franchise because you knew they were committed in every way to excellence, and that's what you wanted to be a part of.
On the tail end of that wonderful insight into Jim's decision-making and move to the Seattle Supersonics, part 1 of the conversation ends here. Make sure you listen to part 2 of this chat, which will be episode 40. We continue discussing Jim's playing days with Seattle, then the New Jersey Nets, and also his post-NBA career, where he is currently a broadcaster at the university where he starred, Marquette. Part 2 is as interesting and entertaining as what you've just listened to. Thanks again, Jim. It was a pleasure to have you as a guest. Thanks for listening. I hope you enjoyed the show, and share my web address with your friends and colleagues, installments.com. Check out the podcast archive for plenty more episodes with high-profile guests. Follow me on Twitter @inallairness. Please add your like to the show's social hub, facebook.com/inallairness. Join me next time for another edition of the show.